Democratic socialists are taking over American cities, and that could fundamentally change urban life and the political landscape in America. If you don't know the name Janeese Lewis George yet, you should probably get used to hearing it. Lewis George won the Democratic primary for mayor of Washington, D.C. in June, which of course means Lewis George basically won the mayorship of Washington, D.C. in June. And this was pretty significant on a local level. Lewis George was younger, less experienced, and less establishment than her main opponent, and she beat him easily. The biggest reason this matters, though, is simple. Lewis George is a Democratic socialist, and it's worth thinking about that on a really basic level for a second. The capital city of the wealthiest, most powerful country in the world, the country that has done more than any to spread capitalism and capitalist ideas throughout the globe, will now be led by a socialist. That's a really big deal. And it's why, if you follow politics, you're probably going to be hearing Lewis George's name a lot in the years ahead. Because there is a real potential that DC and the federal government are now on a collision course. DC has had control of most of its local affairs since 1973. When Congress passed the Home Rule Act. But the federal government does still have control and veto power over a lot of the district's policies, which Republicans especially have historically been very happy to use, on issues from marijuana to abortion rights to charter schools. Even many Democrats have supported some of those efforts sometimes, like in 2023. Donald Trump himself has now called for curtailing DC's home rule.
And maybe we'll take back Washington, run it on the federal basis.
And Lewis George gives him an ideal foil. It's kind of a perfect storm for conflict. And it could be a real storyline for Trump's final 2 years. But you should know about Lewis George for another bigger reason. She is part of a wave of new socialist mayors in big cities. And that could remake the Democratic Party and urban life in America. Across the country, we are seeing the emergence of a real beachhead of socialist political power, concentrated in big blue urban enclaves. Of course, there is Zohran Mamdani, who leads the country's largest city and has become a genuine political and pop culture phenomenon. But it's not just him. Seattle is now led by Katie Wilson, who defeated the incumbent mayor in the 2025 election. She's since broken with decades of the status quo, aggressively going after companies like Starbucks and Amazon, which have deep roots in the city and traditionally have had a lot of political power there. In Los Angeles, Nithya Raman is in a runoff with the incumbent mayor, Karen Bass. And at least so far, early polling shows it as a toss-up, and a real possibility that Raman could win. And if she does, it would punctuate a really clear trend. A decade ago, Bernie Sanders was basically laughed out of a lot of rooms for being a Democratic socialist, and he had to constantly explain what that label even meant. Now we could be looking at the country's two largest cities and its capital city all being led by socialists. That is a genuinely huge change to American politics, and to me, there's three things going on that have made this possible. First, Democratic socialists are benefiting from frustration with Trump and establishment Democrats. This is pretty obvious and has been part of the political landscape since the day Trump won his second term, but it does bear repeating. Rank-and-file Democratic voters have gotten radicalized into a much more aggressive posture towards Republicans and the political establishment over the past year and a half. Now, one thing that isn't discussed by a lot of people is that 2026 has actually seen Democratic voters steadily improving their view of the Democratic Party. It's no longer true that average Democrats are dissatisfied with their party at historic levels, or that the Democratic Party is way more unpopular than the Republican Party. Obviously, that could change, but for now, that looks like it was a 2025 thing, not a 2026 thing. Still, it is clear that Democrats have a real eagerness for people who can convey a sense of urgency, of new ideas, new energy, a fighting spirit. Polling from the left, the right, the center confirms it. More than anything, Democratic voters want fighters right now. And that is, more than anything, what links together the people who are winning Democratic primaries. And Democratic socialists, who are still largely outsiders to the political establishment, are well positioned to capitalize on that. Second, life in American cities is absurdly unaffordable, and people are getting more willing to try something new. Look, part of the reason this is happening in cities right now is simple, and that is that cities are by far the most liberal parts of the country. DC, for example, has given Democratic nominees for president 90% of the vote for decades. And that's just a feature of history as well. Cities are historically where artists and activists and academics all move to congregate. It's a perfect melting pot for things like socialism. But there's something more happening here than just lefties live in cities. We've talked on this show before about how the affordability crisis is the fulcrum of this decade of American politics. And it is true that it's affecting everyone in the country. Healthcare, prescription drugs, groceries, childcare, college, whatever. It's expensive whether you live in a suburb, A small town, a big city, the boonies, whatever. But it is just plainly true that cities are a particularly unaffordable place to live right now. There's a lot of reasons for that. Some are local, some are national, some are international. Cities are unaffordable across the entire industrialized world right now. But however you diagnose it, it's just a fact. Middle-class living in American cities has been on life support for decades, and it's now in danger of disappearing completely. In 1970, about half of the neighborhoods inside the 100 largest cities in the US were middle income. By 2000, it was less than a quarter, and that was a quarter century ago. Some estimates now place it around 10%. More and more, cities are populated by rich people and poor people. And increasingly, they're now becoming the playground of a wealthy elite class, where rich people raise rich kids, and then rich kids grow up and raise more rich kids. This is reflected in racial data. After decades of the white population declining in major cities, it's now noticeably increasing, which is coming from one very narrow slice of the white population. And so, with that as the trajectory, it makes sense that more people, especially the remaining middle and working class people, are becoming more open to something completely different. Something that, even if they might have some reservations about it, treats their core affordability problem with actual urgency. Say whatever you want about democratic socialists, think whatever you want about them, but wherever you sit on the political spectrum, I think we would all agree that they're more passionate about, more aggressive about economic disparities and injustice than establishment Democrats. Just like we would all agree that Trump is more passionate about, more aggressive about immigration than establishment Republicans. But here's the thing, a lot of this isn't actually just the working class. Increasingly, even upper middle class incomes no longer provide an easy life in many US cities. And that's kind of crucial here. More and more, you have a lot of college-educated, white-collar office workers, people who make six figures, watching city life slip away even from them. And the combination of their educational and cultural background plus that economic situation is producing a lot of people sympathetic to democratic socialism. Essentially, as long as the floor for a livable life in cities keeps rising, there are going to be more and more potential customers for democratic socialism. By the way, if you like what we're doing here, make sure to hit subscribe to the channel and my newsletter down below. It's the best way to support us. Finally, and maybe most importantly, is the drop in concerns about crime. The farther we get away from it, the more clearly we can see a lot of what COVID did to us. And one thing that's become really obvious is that the combination of the lockdowns and the crime and disorder of this time fundamentally broke something in the electorate. The polling on this is pretty astonishing when you look at it. According to Gallup, the immediate post-COVID years found Americans becoming more concerned about crime than any time since the 1980s. More concerned than the 1990s and 2000s, when violent crime was objectively way higher. Now here's the thing, violent crime did tick up a little bit. That was real. But also, Americans have for years and years and years, believed that crime was going up when it was really objectively, provably going down. So in some ways, polling around what Americans think of crime is sometimes about something else, something parallel to crime or a little bit deeper. And to me, the single biggest thing to understand is that after COVID, what we were mostly talking about was actually public disorder. Public disorder can involve crime, don't get me wrong, but not always. Sometimes it's just things being disorderly. Boarded up window shops, people passed out drunk or on drugs in public, train stations full of homeless people, people having mental health episodes in public, people smoking cigarettes inside of buses or subway cars, people yelling at clerks. And that absolutely went up during and after COVID. It's clear by now that 2020 was a perfect storm event for a lot of cities. Public resources pulled back, businesses and foot traffic disappeared from downtowns, people with mental health or substance abuse issues got cut off from resources and routines. And so when people returned to normal life in 2021 and 2022, even though crime was still way, way below what it was in the 80s, 90s, and 2000s, there was a lot to figure out and a lot of awareness that there was a lot to figure out, and polling reflected that. Voters, including Democrats, became much more concerned about crime during that time. And that was terrible for Democratic Socialist candidates, who are just objectively typically much softer on crime, especially after so many of them endorsed the defund the police movement in 2020, which was very unpopular with voters. So for a while, more establishment, more moderate Democrats had a great cudgel against Democratic Socialists. I'll be better on crime and public disorder. And we saw a lot of those kinds of Democrats run that very playbook very successfully during this micro period. People like Byron Brown in Buffalo, Eric Adams in New York, Sherrell Parker in Philadelphia, and Daniel Lurie in San Francisco. But now, crime has dropped. And polls show that concerns about crime have dropped even more. The percentage of Americans saying there's more crime in their immediate area has gone from the highest number since Gallup started asking the question to the second lowest number they've ever found. And that actually makes a lot of sense given the facts. According to FBI statistics, violent crime is now way down, below pre-COVID levels. And the murder rate, which is what really spiked during COVID, is now at a 100-year low. And maybe just as importantly, a lot of cities have figured out much of their post-COVID disorder issues. And that's probably having a particular effect among non-white Democrats, who for years were more concerned about crime than white Democrats, which does a lot to help explain why Democratic Socialist candidates are now finally seeing some inroads among non-white voters. In 2025, Mamdani had a breakthrough with Black, Latino, and Asian voters. In DC, Lewis George won big among white and college-educated voters, but also among Black voters. And in June, 3 candidates aligned with the DSA won majority-minority congressional primaries in New York. And so, again, as is always the case with COVID stuff, we need a little bit of distance to fully understand and contextualize everything it did to us. Economically, psychologically, socially. But more and more, it's getting easy to construct this story of the Democratic Party's past 10 years. Their voters have been getting more liberal and more comfortable with socialism for years. Then Bernie Sanders came along and almost single-handedly shifted the Overton window within the party, inspiring even more leftward movement. But then the COVID-era disorder put that on pause. And now, with crime having faded as an issue, Democrats are just returning to the trajectory they were on pre-COVID, with a boost from Trump's return and the affordability crisis. And looking at it like that makes the wave of socialist victories make a lot more sense, and makes it look like the beginning of something bigger. Because what we're seeing now could very well just be the opening act of a much bigger resurgence in urban socialism. The last time we saw socialism with this level of political power was over a century ago. Historians generally regard American socialism to have peaked in the 1910s, amid the inequality, upheaval, and labor organizing of the Gilded Age and Progressive Era. And there were a lot of reasons for its decline after. But ultimately, a main one was that the Democratic Party absorbed a lot of the energy that was driving that socialist surge. For example, leftist and progressive parties merged with the local Democratic Party in a lot of states. But most importantly, Democrats like FDR embraced and co-opted some socialist ideals. FDR was not a socialist. The New Deal was not socialist, but it did incorporate and implement a lot of ideas that were previously on the socialist fringe. So even as socialist office holders declined, the broader movement won a lot of the policy arguments of that era. Now, a century later, we're in a new era of inequality, a new era of upheaval. Just like then, we're seeing momentum in the labor movement, with union membership finally regaining at least a little bit of its lost ground. And we're seeing a surge in socialist power, the likes of which we have not seen since then. And if the past is prologue, that might have longer effects than we know right now. What's your main theory of what's going on here? Let me know in the comments below, and make sure to subscribe to the channel and my newsletter.